Right now, India is pulling off one of the greatest geopolitical moves in human history. It is teaming up with key global players to build a completely new world order. Without launching a single weapon or joining a Western alliance, India is quietly taking control of the global supply chain by creating a web of strategic partnerships. India has positioned itself as the country that every other country must work through, the indispensable player that no coalition can function without. It is the player at the heart of every strategic trade corridor and every credible Indo-Pacific arrangement. Here is how India is building the future order, what each alliance means, what India gets from it, and what it says about the world being assembled right now. Relationship 1. India and Japan. Japan understands the China threat more viscerally than almost any other country because Japan has already experienced what it looks like when a single country controls the materials your most important industries cannot live without. In 2010, at the peak of the Senkaku Islands dispute, China restricted rare earth exports to Japan. Japanese industries felt the supply shock almost immediately. That moment changed Japan's strategic thinking permanently. Tokyo spent the following decade diversifying suppliers, building stockpiles, and looking for trusted partners outside China. That search led to India. Japan committed to invest 10 trillion yen, approximately $68 billion, in India over the next 10 years. India has been ranked the top investment destination for Japanese businesses for 4 consecutive years. Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba was direct in describing why. India's market is so full of potential that incorporating its growth will help drive Japan's own economy. Japan needs external growth because its own population is aging and declining. India is one of the few places on Earth that can provide growth at the scale Japan requires. The 8 sectors Japan identified for priority investment: semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, mobility, environment, medicine, and advanced manufacturing, map precisely onto India's own strategic priorities under Make in India, the PLI scheme, and the National Semiconductor Mission. Japan brings precision manufacturing expertise and capital. India brings scale, young workforce, policy framework, and domestic market. The combination is genuinely complementary. Japan is also deeply embedded in India's defense architecture. The Quad is built substantially on the India-Japan strategic relationship. The two countries conduct regular naval exercises. Japan's defense industry is exploring co-production arrangements in India. The maritime surveillance network being developed between India, Japan, Australia, and the United States in the Indian Ocean directly serves Japan's need to monitor Chinese naval movements. Japan is not just investing in India's economy. Japan is buying strategic insurance against the day Beijing decides to turn off the tap again. Relationship 2. India and Australia. Australia and India's relationship has transformed remarkably since 2020. As recently as the early 2010s, Australia was so nervous about antagonizing China that it withdrew from the Malabar military exercise, a joint naval drill with India, Japan, and the United States, specifically to avoid upsetting Beijing. Today, Australia is giving India access to a strategic island in the Indian Ocean, supplying uranium for India's nuclear power program, and openly welcoming the Indian diaspora. Let's start with the Cocos or Keeling Islands. At first glance, they look like a tiny group of islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean, but their location makes them one of Australia's most strategically valuable territories. They sit in the eastern Indian Ocean, close to some of the world's busiest shipping routes and roughly halfway between India's western coast and mainland Australia. During Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Australia on July 9, 2026, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced that Australia will allow India to set up a temporary space tracking terminal on the Cocos Islands. The facility will support ISRO's Gaganyaan program by tracking and communicating with India's human spaceflight missions. Now on paper, this is a space cooperation agreement, but strategically it means much more. The Cocos Islands overlook one of the most important maritime regions in the Indo-Pacific. Any country operating from these islands gains a better view of shipping traffic and naval activity across the eastern Indian Ocean. Australia is not handing over the islands or creating an Indian military base there, but by allowing Indian personnel and technology to operate from such a strategic location, Australia is sending a clear message. It trusts India as a long-term security partner and is willing to deepen defense cooperation whenever needed. The two countries have also agreed to increase joint military exercises, improve interoperability between their armed forces, and strengthen cooperation across the Indo-Pacific. This is a remarkable change, and the partnership doesn't stop here. Australia is also becoming a key supplier for India's clean energy ambitions. Australia possesses the world's largest known uranium reserves. For years, it refused to export uranium to India because India is not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Despite India's strong non-proliferation record, Canberra maintained that policy for decades. Now that has changed. During the 2026 summit, both countries finalized the administrative arrangements needed for long-term Australian uranium exports to India under strict international safeguards and exclusively for peaceful civilian use. Australia also reaffirmed its support for India's membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. This is a major boost for India's energy security. India plans to build 100 gigawatts of nuclear power capacity by 2047. That is enough to provide reliable electricity to tens of millions of homes while reducing dependence on fossil fuels. Securing a long-term uranium supply from Australia makes that goal much more achievable and gives India a trusted source of nuclear fuel for decades to come. The relationship is also growing beyond defense and energy. More than 140,000 Indian students are already studying in Australia, making India one of the country's largest sources of international students. Both governments have announced new cooperation in education, technology, critical minerals, cybersecurity, and advanced manufacturing, while Australian leaders continue to welcome Indian professionals, researchers, entrepreneurs, and skilled workers as an important part of the country's future workforce. Relationship 3. India and France. France was the country that sold India Rafale fighter jets and then watched the relationship mature into something far more substantial. The Rafale deal was a beginning, not a destination. By the G7 summit in 2026, French diplomatic sources were describing India as the top priority for the entire summit. Not because India is a G7 member, it is not, but because France understood something that other European countries were slower to recognize. India is the only major power that can move fluidly between the Western alliance system and the global South without fully belonging to either. For a France that is increasingly uncomfortable with American unpredictability under Donald Trump's second presidency and increasingly nervous about its own strategic dependence on Washington, India represents an alternative anchor. Paris and New Delhi share a foundational conviction in strategic autonomy, believing nations must maintain the independent right to act without becoming reliant on or subordinate to any single global superpower. France has been arguing this within NATO for decades. India has been practicing it as its core foreign policy doctrine throughout. For the first time in the modern era, there is a genuine alignment of strategic philosophy between these two powers. The France-India relationship covers defense, civil nuclear energy, critical minerals, space, and now artificial intelligence. France is India's Rafale partner, its civil nuclear collaborator, its space research partner through ISRO-KNES cooperation, and its G7 advocate. Macron is reportedly pushing for 12 specific deliverables from the India-France relationship, covering defense cooperation, critical minerals, technology collaboration, and expanding Indian student mobility in France to 30,000 students by 2030. India gains from this relationship in ways that extend beyond any single sector. France is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. France has influence across much of Africa through its military presence and historical relationships. France is the most powerful military in the European Union after Brexit. For India's ambition to be a voice in every room where global rules are made, including rooms where India is not yet a formal member, France is one of the most useful partners India could have. Relationship 4. India and Indonesia. Indonesia's President Prabowo Subianto said something at a state event that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. He said he had undergone genome sequencing before his state visit to India and discovered he had Indian DNA. He said this is why every time he hears Indian music, his body starts moving. He said he had studied PM Modi's policies extensively before becoming president, and because there are no copyright laws for governance ideas, he copied many of them. He concluded that Indonesians must learn from the experience of India. This was not mere flattery. It reflected a genuine realignment of how Indonesia, the world's third largest democracy, the most populous Muslim-majority country, and the fourth most populous nation on earth, positions itself relative to the great powers. Indonesia has spent decades trying to maintain equidistance between China and the United States. Under President Subianto, it is tilting toward India. The strategic logic is straightforward. Indonesia controls several thousand islands scattered across the South China Sea, including the Malacca Strait, the narrow passage through which approximately 80% of China's imported crude oil travels. China has territorial disputes with Indonesia over parts of the South China Sea. The Chinese Coast Guard and fishing fleets have repeatedly entered waters Indonesia considers its own. Indonesia needs a defense partner that can provide real military capability without the political conditions that come with American or Chinese equipment. India provided exactly that. The BrahMos supersonic cruise missile, developed jointly by India and Russia, with India holding the majority stake and controlling the technology, is now going to Indonesia. The missile flies at nearly 3 times the speed of sound, at near sea level altitude, making it almost impossible for conventional radar and interception systems to engage. No radar can catch it because it approaches its target flying parallel to the surface of the ocean, below the horizon of most defense systems. Beyond BrahMos, India and Indonesia signed a deal for Astra, India's own beyond visual range air-to-air missile, developed by DRDO, capable of intercepting incoming missiles at distances of 100 kilometers. Total defense deal value, approximately $200 million US, 20 agreements signed in a single visit. The Sabang port agreement may be the most consequential piece. Sabang, located on the northern tip of Indonesia's Aceh province, sits at the western entrance of the Malacca Strait, approximately 160 kilometers from India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Under the new agreement, India will not just develop the port. India's navy, submarines, and defense equipment will have docking rights at Sabang. That means India will have a military presence at both ends of the strait, with the Andaman and Nicobar Islands at the eastern approach and Sabang at the western exit. China's Malacca dilemma, the strategic fear that a hostile power could choke off China's oil supply by controlling the strait, just became significantly more real. India is not threatening that chokehold. It is positioning itself to credibly hold it as a deterrent. Relationship 5. India and Italy. In 2026, India and Italy upgraded their bilateral relationship to a special strategic partnership, a designation India has extended to only a handful of countries, alongside the United States, Japan, and Australia. The elevation was no mere formality. It came with a defense industrial roadmap, a bilateral trade target of 20 billion euros by 2029, up from 14 billion, a joint critical minerals agreement, and the establishment of Innovate India, a dedicated innovation hub connecting Italian and Indian startups, universities, and research institutions in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, fintech, and semiconductors. The defense dimension is particularly significant. Italy's defense industry has capabilities that India needs, and that carry none of the political complications attached to American or Russian equipment. Italian firms have expertise in naval electronic warfare, helicopters, radar systems, and maritime platforms. Fincantieri, one of the world's most respected naval shipbuilders, is seeking a significant presence in the Indian market. The Adani Leonardo helicopter manufacturing MOU means that military helicopters will eventually be built on Indian soil by an Indian company in collaboration with one of Europe's finest aerospace firms. The IMEC commitment anchors the relationship in something even larger. The India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, the trade and infrastructure route connecting India to Europe through the Gulf, runs through Italian ports if it reaches European soil. Italy is positioning itself as the European terminal of IMEC, which would transform its ports and logistics infrastructure into critical nodes in a new Eurasian connectivity system. For India, IMEC reduces dependence on any single trade route and gives Indian exports a direct path to European markets. For Italy, it gives Italian ports relevance in the global trade geography of the next 50 years. Italy is also an important ally within the European Union as India navigates its free trade agreement with the EU. Having Italy as an advocate is worth considerably more than most headlines about this relationship have acknowledged. Relationship 6, India and Seychelles. Despite its tiny size, the Seychelles holds massive power in the Indian Ocean, sitting directly on the world's most critical shipping and military routes. Around 5% of the Seychelles' 1.2 lakh people are of Indian origin. This creates a powerful cultural bond that no other global superpower can touch. Seychelles' 1.3 million square kilometer exclusive economic zone overlooks the Mozambique Channel, a critical maritime choke point and sea lane for global shipping. It lies close to the Gulf of Aden in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the choke point connecting the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. From the Seychelles, a surveillance network can monitor shipping, submarines, and aircraft across the entire Western Indian Ocean, the waters through which the energy supplies of Europe, Asia, and South Asia all travel. India has maintained a close partnership with the Seychelles since 1976. Indian warships regularly patrol the island nation's exclusive economic zone. India has supplied patrol vessels, maritime surveillance aircraft, and helicopters to the Seychelles Defense Forces. India has extended $150 million in lines of credit and grants, funding the country's National Assembly building, judicial complex, healthcare system, and IT infrastructure. During PM Modi's 2026 visit, the second time an Indian Prime Minister has visited the Seychelles, and the first time any Indian PM has visited twice, 9 agreements were signed covering digital payments through UPI, agriculture, affordable medicines, maritime training, space cooperation, healthcare, and an extradition treaty. India also handed over a new fast patrol vessel, utility vehicles, and essential supplies. The Assumption Island project, where India is developing a port and runway facility, is critical to understanding what India is building in the Western Indian Ocean. The island, leased to India by the Seychelles, could eventually function as an Indian logistics and surveillance facility in one of the world's most strategically contested maritime spaces. When completed and combined with the Agalia Islands facility that India completed in Mauritius, it gives the Indian Navy a credible operational presence in the Western Indian Ocean that no other non-Western power can match. China understands exactly what this means. Chinese involvement in creating opposition to the Assumption Island project, through proxies and information operations, was assessed by Indian intelligence as a genuine factor in the delays the project faced. The fact that it is moving forward regardless is itself a statement of India's resolve in the Indian Ocean. Relationship 7, India and UAE. The UAE has been a loyal customer of American and Western defense systems for decades. It operates 12 Patriot air defense batteries. It signed a $183 million Patriot contract plus a $35 billion plus memorandum with South Korea. Its defense architecture has been built around the assumption that the most advanced systems in the world come from the United States and its allies. Operation Sindoor changed that calculation. When India's Akash-Tir integrated air defense and command system shot down more than 300 Pakistani drones during the conflict, none of which reached their target. The Gulf defense community took notice. The economics of modern air defense had just been demonstrated in live combat. A Shahed drone costs a few $1,000s. A Patriot PAC-3 interceptor missile costs $3 to $4 million per shot. Shooting down hundreds of cheap drones with expensive missiles is economically unsustainable in a prolonged conflict. Akash-Tir demonstrated a different model. India and the UAE have entered formal defense discussions covering BrahMos and Akashtir. Bharat Electronics Limited and Bharat Dynamics Limited, the Indian companies behind Akashtir and BrahMos-related systems, saw their stock prices rise on the news as investors recognized what Gulf procurement would mean for India's defense export order book. The UAE relationship extends well beyond defense. India and the UAE have a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. The UAE is one of India's largest trading partners and a massive destination for the Indian diaspora. Approximately 3.5 million Indians live and work in the UAE. UPI is operational in the UAE. The two economies are deeply intertwined, but the defense dimension represents a new chapter. If the UAE completes a BrahMos acquisition, it will become the fourth country after Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia to field Indian-made supersonic cruise missiles. The Gulf would move from being an exclusively Western defense customer to a diversified buyer in which India holds a significant and growing position. That is a transformation in the geopolitics of the region that no one predicted 5 years ago. Relationship 8. India and New Zealand. New Zealand is a small country of 5 million people at the edge of the Pacific. It is also a member of Five Eyes, the intelligence-sharing alliance between the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. It is a member of AUKUS's extended technology-sharing discussions. And in April 2026, it became the most recent country to sign a free trade agreement with India. The India-New Zealand FTA is the first free trade agreement between the two countries after decades of intermittent negotiations. It opens New Zealand's agricultural products to the Indian market, while giving Indian pharmaceutical, textile, and IT exports preferential access to New Zealand. More importantly, it formalizes a relationship that has been warming steadily as New Zealand's strategic priorities have shifted. Like Australia, New Zealand has moved away from the instinct to avoid provoking China that defined much of its Pacific foreign policy in the 2000s and 10s. China's economic pressure on Australia over the COVID inquiry, which imposed trade restrictions on Australian barley, wine, beef, and coal, sent a clear message to all of China's trading partners in the Pacific about the risks of economic dependence. New Zealand drew its own conclusions. Prime Minister Modi's visit, the first Indian prime ministerial visit since 1984, signals that India considers New Zealand part of its Indo-Pacific strategic footprint, not a peripheral relationship. The Pacific Gateway New Zealand represents, the Five Eyes intelligence network it is embedded in, and the research and education institutions it hosts. New Zealand university collaborations with Indian institutions are a growing part of the relationship. Make it a more consequential partner than its size suggests. The 40-year gap in prime ministerial visits is itself a kind of metric. India has been reclaiming relationships it should have invested in decades ago, and doing it at a pace that reflects genuine strategic moves. New Zealand at this moment is the Pacific anchor of a network that runs from the Seychelles to Auckland. Relationship 9. India and Philippines. When India decided to sell BrahMos to the Philippines, it crossed a threshold that no major power had crossed before. It sold a cutting-edge offensive precision missile system to a country in an active territorial dispute with China. The Philippines has been the most vocal critic of China's behavior in the South China Sea. Chinese Coast Guard vessels have used water cannons against Philippine supply ships, delivering food and medicine to Filipino soldiers stationed on disputed outposts. China has built artificial islands on submerged reefs that Philippine courts and international tribunals have ruled are Philippine territory. The Philippines needed a deterrent, a weapon capable of threatening Chinese naval vessels at range that could not be stopped by Chinese diplomatic pressure on suppliers. India provided it. The BrahMos agreement with the Philippines was a breakthrough in Indian arms export history. Vietnam followed with its own discussions and agreements. Both countries sit on the periphery of the South China Sea. Both have territorial disputes with China, and both now have access to a missile system that China's naval planners must factor into every scenario involving those waters. The strategic geometry this creates for China is genuinely uncomfortable. Beijing's naval expansion in the South China Sea has been premised on the assumption that it faces no credible conventional deterrent from its smaller neighbors. BrahMos changes that. A single BrahMos battery can hold a significant stretch of ocean at risk for any surface vessel. Multiple batteries, distributed across multiple countries ringing the South China Sea, create a web of coverage that any Chinese naval deployment must navigate carefully. India is not building a military alliance in the South China Sea. It is not placing its own forces there. It is selling defensive and offensive capability to countries that have legitimate security needs and genuine territorial grievances. The distinction matters diplomatically, but the strategic effect, a ring of BrahMos-capable nations surrounding the South China Sea, is real regardless of how it is described. Indonesia's acquisition, discussed earlier, completes the southern arc of this ring, Philippines at the northeastern approach, Vietnam along the western coast, Indonesia commanding the southern entrance through the Malacca Strait. India has quietly armed the perimeter of China's most important strategic assertion. Every relationship here describes an alliance that benefits India greatly. None of these relationships are anti-China in the sense of being hostile to Chinese citizens or Chinese culture. All of them are pro-India in the sense of advancing Indian interests, Indian security, Indian economic growth, and Indian strategic influence. The distinction matters because India has always positioned itself as a builder, and it is definitely a great one. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to see what India is becoming. Like, subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.